In the mountains of Afghanistan, where the wind carries both dust and death, they called her Ghost. Not because she was invisible, but because her enemies never saw her coming. Sarah Martinez had been counting days until her tour ended, dreaming of her small cabin back home in Montana.
She never imagined that losing everything she owned would lead to the most important shot of her military career. This is the story of how a female sniper's personal tragedy became a nation's victory, and how sometimes the deadliest weapons are forged not in factories, but in the fires of loss and determination. Sarah Martinez crouched behind the wooden crates in the supply depot, her hands shaking as she stared at the satellite phone. The voice on the other end belonged to her neighbor back in Whitefish, Montana, but the words felt like they were coming from another planet.
"Sarah, honey, I'm so sorry. The whole place is gone."
The fire department tried, but by the time they got there, Mrs. Henderson's voice trailed off, and Sarah could hear the old woman crying.
"Gone?" Sarah whispered, her throat tight. "What do you mean, gone?" "The cabin, sweetheart. Lightning struck during that storm last night. It went up so fast. I'm sorry, baby girl. There's nothing left." Sarah ended the call and sat in silence. Around her, the busy sounds of Forward Operating Base Chapman continued. Soldiers moved equipment, helicopters landed and took off, and radios crackled with communications. But for Sarah, everything had stopped. The cabin had been more than just a home. It was her grandfather's place, built by his own hands in 1952 when he returned from Korea. Every log had been carefully selected, every nail driven with purpose. Sarah had spent her childhood summers there, learning to hunt and fish from the old man who rarely spoke, but taught her everything about patience and precision. When her grandfather died 5 years ago, he left the cabin to Sarah. It was the only thing of real value he owned, and she treasured it more than any amount of money.
During her deployment in Afghanistan, she would dream about sitting on the porch, watching the sun rise over Flathead Lake. The cabin represented everything she was fighting to protect and everything she planned to return to. Now it was ash. Sergeant Martinez was known throughout the 75th Ranger Regiment as one of their best snipers. At 26, she had already completed 2 tours in Iraq and was halfway through her second deployment in Afghanistan. Her record spoke for itself: 43 confirmed kills, all of them enemy combatants who had been threatening American or coalition forces. She was professional, deadly accurate, and completely focused on her mission. But sitting in that supply depot, staring at her hands, Sarah felt something breaking inside her chest. The careful control she maintained, the emotional distance that made her effective as a sniper, began to crack. "Martinez." The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant David Chen, her spotter and closest friend in the unit. "You're late for the briefing." Sarah looked up, and Chen immediately noticed something was wrong. In the 18 months they had worked together, he had never seen her look so lost. "What happened?" he asked, settling down beside her. Sarah told him about the cabin, about her grandfather, about the dreams that had kept her sane during the long nights in Afghanistan. Chen listened without interrupting, understanding that sometimes the things that matter most to a soldier are the things they leave behind. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said finally. "I know what that place meant to you." "It was all I had," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Everything else, my parents died in that car crash when I was 17. My grandfather raised me after that. The cabin was the last connection I had to family, to home, and now it's gone." Chen had served 3 tours himself and had seen how loss could affect soldiers. Some became reckless, others withdrew completely. But he sensed something different in Sarah's reaction. There was a coldness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a hardness that went beyond professional detachment. The briefing that afternoon was routine. Intelligence had located a high-value target in the Kunar province, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The target, known by the codename Viper, had been responsible for at least 12 IED attacks in the past 2 months, killing 9 American soldiers and wounding dozens more. Captain Williams, their commanding officer, spread the maps across the table and began explaining the mission. Viper had been tracked to a compound in a remote valley, approximately 800 meters from the nearest feasible sniper position. It was a difficult shot, requiring precision and patience, but well within Sarah's capabilities. "Martinez," Captain Williams said, looking directly at her, "you're our best long-range shooter. This one's yours if you want it." Sarah studied the aerial photographs of the target area. The compound was typical of the region. High walls surrounding several buildings, with limited points of entry or exit. The sniper position would be on a ridge overlooking the valley, exposed but with excellent sightlines. "When?" she asked.
Tomorrow morning. Intel says Viper meets with his cell leaders every Thursday at dawn.
We'll have a narrow window. As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself thinking not about the technical aspects of the shot, but about the soldiers Viper had killed.
Young men and women who, like her, had left homes and families behind to serve their country.
Some of them probably had places they dreamed of returning to, just as she had dreamed of her grandfather's cabin. After the briefing, Sarah went to the armory to check her rifle. The M24 sniper weapon system was a precision instrument, and she treated it with the same care her grandfather had shown his hunting rifles. Every component was cleaned and inspected, every adjustment verified and re-verified.
Chen found her there 2 hours later, still working on the weapon. The rifle was fine when you started, he said. You're going to wear out the barrel if you keep cleaning it. Sarah looked up from the scope she was adjusting. I need everything to be perfect tomorrow. It will be. It always is with you. Chen pulled up a chair. But this isn't just about the mission, is it? Sarah set down the scope and leaned back. That cabin was supposed to be my retirement plan. I was going to finish this deployment, serve out my enlistment, and go back to Montana. Maybe become a hunting guide? Or work for the Forest Service. Something quiet and peaceful. You still can do all of that. With what? I had some money saved but not enough to buy another place. That cabin was my foundation, my anchor. Without it. She shrugged, unable to finish the thought. Chen understood. For soldiers deployed far from home, having something solid to return to was crucial for mental health. It provided purpose beyond the immediate mission and hope beyond the current deployment. Without that anchor, some soldiers lost their way. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling. Around her, other soldiers slept soundly, exhausted from the day's patrols and operations. But sleep wouldn't come for her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw flames consuming the cabin, destroying the life she had planned. She thought about her grandfather, remembering the stories he had told about his own war. He had been a Marine sniper in Korea, and though he rarely spoke about the fighting, he had shared lessons about patience, about breathing, about the moment of perfect stillness that comes just before the shot. A sniper's greatest weapon isn't the rifle. He had told her once when she was 14 and learning to hunt deer. It's the ability to become completely calm, completely focused, even when everything around you is chaos. Sarah had carried that lesson with her through basic training, through sniper school, and through 2 combat deployments. But now, lying in the darkness of the barracks, she wondered if she could find that calm again. The loss of the cabin had shaken something fundamental in her sense of purpose and identity. She thought about the mission tomorrow, about Viper, about the soldiers who would never return to their own homes because of his actions. Gradually, she began to understand something that surprised her. Her anger about the cabin wasn't separate from her duty as a soldier. It was connected to it in a way she hadn't expected. The cabin had represented safety, family, and the peaceful life that her grandfather had built after his own war. Viper and terrorists like him were threats not just to American soldiers, but to the very idea that people could build quiet, meaningful lives without fear of violence. In destroying those lives, they destroyed the things that made military service worthwhile. By morning, Sarah had found a different kind of calm than she had ever experienced before. It wasn't the professional detachment of a soldier doing her job. It was something deeper and more personal. The loss of her cabin had connected her to the mission in a way that went beyond duty or orders. She arose before dawn, prepared her equipment, and checked her rifle one final time. In a few hours, she would be lying on a ridge in the Kunar province, looking through a scope at a man who had dedicated his life to destroying the things she valued most. Chen found her in the mess hall, eating a quiet breakfast, and reviewing the mission parameters one more time. Ready? He asked. Sarah looked up at him, and he was surprised by what he saw in her eyes. The lost look from yesterday was gone, replaced by something he had never seen before. Not just professional competence, but personal conviction. Yes, she said simply. I'm ready. As they prepared to board the helicopter that would take them to their insertion point, Sarah took one last look at the photograph Mrs. Henderson had sent her via email. It showed the remains of the cabin, a few charred logs, and the stone foundation her grandfather had laid by hand 60 years earlier. The foundation was still there, blackened but intact. Looking at it, Sarah realized something important. The cabin could be rebuilt. The logs and roof and windows could all be replaced, but the foundation, the solid base that her grandfather had created, remained. She had lost her home, but she hadn't lost her foundation, and today she would use that foundation to strike back at those who threatened the homes and families of others. The shot she was about to take would be personal in a way that went beyond her military training. It would be a statement that some things placed were worth fighting for with everything she had. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying her toward the mountains where Viper was waiting, Sarah felt the calm her grandfather had taught her settling over her like a familiar blanket. She was ready to do what she did best, but for reasons that went deeper than she had ever understood before. The flames that had taken her cabin had also forged something new in her, a clarity of purpose that would make her deadlier than she had ever been. The helicopter banked sharply as it approached the landing zone, and Sarah felt her stomach drop. Below them, the rugged mountains of the Kunar province stretched endlessly in all directions, their peaks still shrouded in the purple shadows of pre-dawn darkness. This was some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan, where Taliban fighters moved freely and coalition forces were always at risk. Sarah checked her gear one final time. Her M24 rifle was secured in its case along with 20 rounds of match-grade ammunition. Her spotting scope, rangefinder, and communication equipment were all properly stowed. Most importantly, she had studied every detail of the target area until she could navigate it blindfolded. Chen sat across from her in the helicopter, his own equipment ready. As her spotter, his job was to help her identify targets, calculate range and wind conditions, and watch for threats while she focused on the shot. They had worked together so long that they could communicate with just a glance or a hand signal. 2 minutes! The crew chief shouted over the noise of the rotors. Sarah nodded and began the mental preparation ritual her grandfather had taught her. She closed her eyes and visualized the target area, imagining herself moving from the landing zone to the sniper position, setting up her equipment, acquiring the target, and taking the shot. Mental rehearsal was crucial for long-range precision shooting, allowing the sniper to work through potential problems before they occurred in real life. The helicopter touched down in a small clearing 3 kilometers from the target compound. Sarah and Chen quickly gathered their gear and moved away from the aircraft, which immediately lifted off to avoid being detected by enemy forces in the area. The silence that followed the helicopter's departure was absolute. Sarah had forgotten how quiet the mountains could be at night, with only the whisper of wind through the rocks and the distant sound of her own breathing. She checked her watch. 0400 hours. They had 3 hours to reach the sniper position and prepare for the shot. The terrain was brutal. The path to the ridge overlooking Viper's compound was steep and rocky, requiring them to climb over loose stones and navigate around cliff faces in near-total darkness. Sarah had trained for conditions like this, but carrying 60 pounds of equipment while maintaining tactical silence made every step a challenge. Chen led the way, using night vision goggles to pick out the safest route. Behind him, Sarah moved with the careful, deliberate pace of an experienced mountain climber. She had learned long ago that speed was less important than arriving at the destination without injuries or exhaustion that could affect her shooting. As they climbed, Sarah found her mind wandering back to similar hunts with her grandfather in the mountains of Montana. The old man had taught her that hunting was about more than just killing. It was about understanding the environment, reading the wind and weather, and becoming part of the landscape until you could predict what your prey would do before it knew itself. Patience is the sniper's greatest virtue, he had told her during one memorable elk hunt when she was 16. Any fool can pull a trigger. But it takes wisdom to know when not to shoot, and courage to wait for the perfect moment even when everything in your body is telling you to hurry. That lesson had served her well in Iraq and Afghanistan. While other soldiers sometimes rushed their shots and missed crucial targets, Sarah had developed a reputation for taking only the shots she was certain of. Her kill rate was higher than almost any other sniper in her unit, not because she was lucky, but because she never fired until conditions were perfect. After 2 hours of climbing, they reached a plateau about 500 meters below their final destination. Chen called for a rest break, and they both drank water and checked their equipment. The eastern horizon was beginning to show the first faint traces of dawn. "How are you feeling?" Chen asked quietly. Sarah considered the question. Physically, she felt strong despite the climb. Mentally, she was focused and alert. But emotionally, she was experiencing something she had never felt before. On a mission, a sense of personal investment that went beyond professional duty. "Different," she answered honestly. "This one feels personal." Chen nodded. He had been wondering how the loss of her cabin would affect her performance. Some snipers performed better when they were angry, channeling their emotions into deadly precision. Others became reckless or lost their ability to think clearly. With Sarah, he sensed something else. Not anger exactly, but a kind of cold determination. They resumed climbing, and 30 minutes later reached the sniper position. It was exactly as described in the intelligence briefings. A narrow ridge with excellent sightlines to the target compound, but completely exposed to observation from multiple directions. Setting up here would require perfect camouflage and absolute stillness once they were in position. Sarah unpacked her rifle and began the careful process of preparing for the shot. First, she assembled the weapon and mounted her scope, checking every connection and adjustment. Then she set up her shooting mat and bipod, creating a stable platform for the rifle. Finally, she used her rangefinder to measure the exact distance to the target compound. 847 meters. Well within her effective range but requiring precise calculations for bullet drop and wind drift. Chen established his position slightly behind and to the left of Sarah, where he could observe the target area through his spotting scope, while also watching for enemy activity in other directions. He began recording wind speed and direction, air temperature, and humidity, all factors that would affect the bullet's trajectory over such a long distance. As the sun rose higher, details of the target compound became visible through their scopes. The building where Viper was expected to meet with his subordinates was a traditional Afghan structure, with thick mud brick walls and a flat roof. The meeting was supposed to take place in a courtyard on the eastern side of the building, where intelligence sources indicated Viper would be vulnerable to observation and engagement. Sarah adjusted her scope and studied the courtyard carefully. There were several positions where a person might stand or sit, but only 2 offered clear lines of sight from her position. She would need to be ready to engage quickly when the target appeared, as the meeting was not expected to last long.
Movement, Chen whispered into his radio microphone.
Multiple individuals entering the compound from the south. Sarah shifted her rifle slightly and peered through her scope. 3 men in traditional Afghan clothing were walking through the compound's main gate, followed by 2 others who appeared to be guards. None of them matched the description of Viper, a tall, thin man with a distinctive beard and a scar on his left cheek. The waiting began. For the next hour, Sarah lay motionless behind her rifle, watching the compound through her scope. Several more people entered and left the building, but none of them was the target. The sun climbed higher and the temperature began to rise, making the metal of her rifle uncomfortably hot to the touch. Sarah had spent hundreds of hours in similar positions during her previous deployments, waiting for targets that sometimes never appeared. She understood that patience was essential, but today the waiting felt different. Every minute that passed was another minute that Viper remained free to plan attacks against coalition forces. She thought about the soldiers who had been killed by Viper's IEDs. They had names and faces and families, though she didn't know most of them personally. But they had all been people like her, young Americans who had volunteered to serve their country and had died far from home because of men like the one she was hunting today. Target acquired, Chen said suddenly, his voice tight with excitement. Sarah shifted her scope to the courtyard and immediately saw him. Viper was exactly as described in the intelligence briefings. Tall, thin, with a black beard and a visible scar running from his left ear to his jaw. He was standing in the center of the courtyard, talking animatedly to 4 other men who appeared to be listening carefully to his instructions. Sarah settled into her shooting position and began her final preparations. She checked the wind flags they had placed at various distances to gauge air movement, calculated the necessary adjustments for range and conditions, and began controlling her breathing to achieve the steady heart rate necessary for an accurate shot. Through her scope, she could see Viper clearly. He was wearing a brown robe and a white turban, and he was gesturing with his hands as he spoke to his subordinates. Sarah could see his face in profile, noting the intensity in his expression and the authority with which he commanded the attention of the other men. For a moment, she allowed herself to think about all the pain this man had caused. The soldiers who had died because of his bombs, the families who had received notification that their sons and daughters were never coming home, the communities in Afghanistan that lived in fear because of his violence. Then she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the technical aspects of the shot. Range, 847 meters. Wind, 3 miles per hour from the southwest. Temperature, rising, but still cool enough that heat distortion wouldn't be a significant factor. Target movement, minimal, as Viper appeared to be standing still while he spoke. Sarah adjusted her scope's elevation and windage knobs, making the precise calculations that would send her bullet to exactly the right spot. She had made similar calculations hundreds of times in training and dozens of times in combat, but never with quite this sense of personal commitment to the outcome. Steady wind, Chen reported. Target is stationary. You have a clear shot. Sarah positioned her eye properly behind the scope and placed her finger on the trigger. She could see Viper's face clearly now, focused and intent, as he gave instructions to his followers. In a few seconds, those instructions would be his last. She began the breathing cycle her grandfather had taught her. A slow, deep breath in, followed by a partial exhale, then holding her breath at the natural respiratory pause. This was the moment of perfect stillness, when her heart rate was at its lowest, and her body was completely stable. The crosshairs of her scope were centered on Viper's chest, just below his left shoulder.
At this range, even a slight miss would still be likely to cause a fatal wound. But Sarah didn't plan to miss.
This shot would be perfect, just like her grandfather had taught her. She began to apply pressure to the trigger, using the smooth, steady squeeze that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of practice. The trigger pull on the M24 was crisp and predictable, requiring exactly 4.5 pounds of pressure to fire. Just as she reached the point of no return, Viper moved. He turned toward one of his subordinates, presenting his back to Sarah's position. The shot she had been preparing was no longer viable. Sarah immediately relaxed her trigger finger and took a breath. Chen, watching through his spotting scope, confirmed that the target had moved out of the optimal engagement zone. "Hold," he whispered. "Target has shifted position." For the next 10 minutes, Sarah maintained her shooting position while Viper moved around the courtyard, sometimes presenting himself as a clear target, and sometimes moving behind cover or other people. Each time she prepared to take the shot, something changed. Wind conditions, target position, or the presence of civilian bystanders who might be injured by a miss. Sarah had learned long ago that the ability to not shoot was just as important as the ability to make an accurate shot. In her previous deployments, she had aborted more missions than she had completed, always waiting for conditions to be perfect rather than risking a shot that might fail or cause unintended casualties. But today, the waiting was harder than it had ever been before. Every moment that Viper remained alive was another moment he could spend planning attacks against American forces. The intelligence briefing had indicated that he was coordinating a major operation against a coalition forward operating base, an attack that could potentially kill or wound dozens of soldiers. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. She understood that her shot today might prevent the deaths of other soldiers, men and women who were depending on her accuracy and judgment, even though they would never know her name. Finally, after 20 minutes of shifting positions and interrupted shots, Viper returned to the center of the courtyard. He was facing Sarah's direction, speaking to two of his subordinates who were standing slightly to his left. The wind had died down, and there were no civilians visible in the immediate area. Chen confirmed the conditions. "Wind is calm, target is clear, you have the shot." Sarah settled back into her shooting position and began her final approach to the trigger. This time she felt the complete calm that her grandfather had taught her to find in moments of supreme importance. All of her training, all of her experience, and all of her personal motivation came together in this single instant. The crosshairs were perfectly aligned on Viper's chest. Her breathing was controlled and steady. Her heart rate was at its minimum. The trigger was pulling back smoothly under the pressure of her finger. And then, in the split second before the rifle fired, Sarah thought of her grandfather's cabin. Not the burned ruins, but the cabin as it had been, solid, peaceful, and representing everything that was worth protecting in the world. The shot she was about to take was for everyone who deserved to have a safe place to call home. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. Through her scope, Sarah saw Viper jerk backward and fall to the ground, struck center mass by the 7.62 mm bullet that had traveled nearly half a mile in just over a second. "Target down," Chen reported, his voice calm and professional despite the significance of what they had just accomplished. But their mission was far from over. Now they had to escape from their exposed position and reach the extraction point before Viper's followers could organize a search for the sniper who had killed their leader. The hardest part of their day was just beginning. The moment after the shot, time seemed to freeze. Through her scope, Sarah watched Viper's body crumple to the ground in the courtyard below. The two men who had been speaking with him stood motionless for several seconds, their minds apparently unable to process what had just happened. Then chaos erupted. Shouts echoed across the valley as Viper's followers realized their leader had been killed by a sniper. Men ran in all directions, some seeking cover, others grabbing weapons, and several racing toward vehicles parked outside the compound. Sarah could see them pointing toward the ridgeline where she and Chen were positioned, though she doubted they could pinpoint her exact location.
"Time to go," Chen said, already packing his spotting scope. "They'll be coming this way soon." Sarah took one last look through her rifle scope to confirm the kill. Viper lay motionless in the courtyard, blood pooling beneath his body. After months of intelligence gathering and planning, the terrorist leader who had been responsible for so many attacks against coalition forces was finally dead. But Sarah felt no satisfaction or celebration, only the cold professional knowledge that the job was done. She quickly disassembled her rifle and packed her equipment. Every movement was practiced and efficient, the result of countless training exercises and combat deployments. Within 3 minutes, both snipers were ready to move, their gear secured and their escape route planned.
The path down from the ridge was even more treacherous than the climb up had been. They were descending loose rock slopes while carrying heavy equipment, trying to maintain speed without creating noise that might help their pursuers track them. Sarah's legs burned from the strain, but she forced herself to maintain the pace Chen was setting. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. Sarah could hear engines starting and vehicles moving along the valley roads. Viper's followers were organizing quickly, and they would soon have search parties combing the ridgeline for the snipers who had killed their leader. After 30 minutes of hard movement, Chen called for a brief halt in a cluster of boulders that provided concealment from observation. Both snipers were breathing heavily, and Sarah could feel sweat running down her back despite the cool morning air. Chen checked his GPS and radio equipment. "Extraction point is still 2 kilometers south," he reported, "but we've got a problem. I'm picking up radio chatter that suggests they've got search teams moving to block our primary route." Sarah studied the map and the terrain around them. The extraction point was in a valley that could only be reached by crossing an exposed slope that offered little cover. If Viper's followers had positioned themselves correctly, they could easily spot and engage the escaping snipers. "What about the alternate route?" she asked. Chen traced a path with his finger that led through a series of ravines and rocky outcroppings. It was longer and more difficult, but it would provide better concealment from observation and potential ambush. "It'll take us an extra hour," he said.
"And we'll have to cross at least 2 positions where we'll be exposed." Sarah checked her watch. The extraction helicopter was scheduled to pick them up at 1100 hours, which gave them less than 3 hours to cover difficult terrain while avoiding enemy search parties.
It would be close, but it was their best option. They resumed movement, now following a route that took them through narrow ravines and across steep slopes covered with loose stone. Several times they had to rope down cliff faces or climb over obstacles that would have been challenging even without the stress of being hunted by armed enemies. As they moved, Sarah found herself thinking about the significance of what they had just accomplished. Viper hadn't just been another Taliban commander. Intelligence reports indicated that he had been one of the key coordinators of insurgent activity in the entire Kunar province. His death would disrupt enemy operations and potentially save dozens of coalition lives. But more than that, eliminating Viper felt like a personal victory in a way that her previous combat kills had not. When her cabin burned down, she had lost something irreplaceable. Not just a building, but a connection to family, to home, and to the peaceful life she had dreamed of building after her military service. Viper represented the forces that threatened those dreams, not just for her but for everyone who wanted to build something positive in the world. The shot that killed Viper had been technically perfect, but it had also been an act of personal defiance. Sarah had declared that the things she valued, family, home, peace, the right to live without fear, were worth fighting for with everything she had. In a strange way, losing her cabin had made her a more dangerous soldier. After 2 hours of movement through increasingly rugged terrain, they approached the final obstacle before the extraction point. It was a steep slope covered with loose rocks and sparse vegetation, offering almost no concealment from observation. Worse, they could see dust clouds in the distance that indicated vehicle movement in the valley below. Chen used his binoculars to study the terrain. "I count at least 3 trucks," he reported. "Looks like they're setting up blocking positions along the road." Sarah looked at the slope they needed to cross. It was perhaps 400 meters of open ground, with no cover except for a few small boulders scattered across the hillside. If they were spotted during the crossing, they would be completely vulnerable to enemy fire. "We go together," Chen decided. "Fast and low. If they spot us, we fight our way through." They prepared their weapons for potential combat and began the crossing. Sarah had never felt so exposed in her life. Every step seemed to echo across the valley, and she was certain that enemy fighters were watching them through binoculars or rifle scopes. Her back muscles tensed in anticipation of the bullet that might end her life at any moment. Halfway across the slope, they heard the sound of engines getting closer. A convoy of 3 pickup trucks was moving up the valley road, clearly searching for the snipers who had killed Viper. Sarah and Chen froze behind a small boulder, hoping their camouflage would make them invisible against the rocky hillside. The truck stopped directly below their position, and Sarah could see armed men getting out and pointing up toward the ridge where they had taken their shot. One of them was carrying what appeared to be binoculars, and he was systematically scanning the slopes for signs of the escaping Americans. For 10 minutes, Sarah and Chen remained completely motionless, hardly daring to breathe. The searchers below were close enough that voices carried clearly on the morning air, though neither American could understand the Afghan languages being spoken. Sarah's rifle was ready to fire,
but she hoped desperately that it wouldn't be necessary. A firefight at this range would almost certainly result in casualties on both sides. Finally, the search party climbed back into their trucks and continued up the valley. Sarah and Chen waited until the vehicles were completely out of sight before resuming their movement across the exposed slope. 20 minutes later, they reached the extraction point, a small clearing surrounded by low hills that provided excellent concealment for a helicopter landing. Chen immediately set up his radio and began communicating with their extraction aircraft, which was already airborne and heading toward their location. Raven 6, this is Ghost 2. He spoke into his handset. We are at Extraction Point Alpha. Mission complete. Ready for pickup. The voice that came back through the radio was calm and professional. Ghost 2. This is Raven 6. We have visual on your position. ETA 3 minutes. Be advised, we have reports of enemy activity in your area. Sarah and Chen quickly established a defensive perimeter around the landing zone, positioning themselves where they could provide covering fire for the helicopter if necessary. Sarah's rifle was loaded and ready, though she hoped the approaching aircraft would be able to land and take off without incident. The sound of rotor blades grew louder, and soon they could see the Black Hawk helicopter approaching from the south. It came in fast and low, clearly designed to minimize the time spent on the ground in potentially hostile territory. Sarah felt a wave of relief as she realized they were moments away from safety. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, and Sarah and Chen ran toward it with their equipment. As they climbed aboard, Sarah took one last look at the mountains, where they had spent the morning. Somewhere in those peaks, Viper's followers were still searching for the snipers who had killed their leader. They would never find them. As the helicopter lifted off and banked toward the south, Chen leaned close to Sarah's ear to be heard over the noise of the rotors. Outstanding shot, he said. Probably saved a lot of lives today. Sarah nodded, but she was thinking about something beyond the immediate tactical success of their mission. The loss of her cabin had changed her in ways that she was still discovering. It had connected her to her work as a soldier in a more personal way, making her understand that the things she was fighting to protect were not abstract concepts, but real, tangible parts of people's lives. She thought about her grandfather and the lessons he had taught her about patience, precision, and the responsibility that came with the ability to take life from a distance. Today, she had used those lessons to eliminate a threat that had been responsible for destroying other people's homes, other people's dreams, other people's connections to the things that made life worth living. The helicopter flew south toward Forward Operating Base Chapman, carrying Sarah back to the routine of military life in a combat zone. But something fundamental had changed in her during the morning's mission. She had discovered that her skills as a sniper could be more than just professional competence. They could be a way of defending the things that mattered most in the world. When they landed at the base, Captain Williams was waiting for them with a broad smile on his face. Intelligence sources had already confirmed Viper's death, and early reports suggested that his organization was in chaos following the loss of their leader. Excellent work, the captain said as Sarah and Chen reported for debriefing. This is going to have a major impact on enemy operations in the province. The debriefing was routine, covering the technical aspects of the mission and the intelligence value of what they had observed. Sarah answered the questions professionally, but part of her mind was elsewhere, thinking about what she would do when her deployment ended in 3 months. That evening, she called Mrs. Henderson in Montana to check on the situation with her burned cabin. The insurance adjuster had completed his report, and the settlement would be enough to clear the debris and rebuild. Not the same cabin her grandfather had built, but something new on the same foundation. I've been thinking, Mrs. J., Henderson said. Your grandfather always talked about how proud he was of your military service. I think he would have wanted you to know that what you're doing over there matters to all of us back home. After ending the call, Sarah walked to the perimeter of the base and looked toward the mountains where she had taken the most important shot of her career. Tomorrow there would be other missions, other targets, and other opportunities to use her skills in defense of the things that mattered. But tonight, she felt a sense of completion that went beyond military success. She had lost her home, but in doing so she had discovered something more important, a sense of purpose that connected her personal values to her professional responsibilities. The cabin could be rebuilt, and probably would be. But the foundation it rested on, like the foundation of everything she was fighting to protect, was stronger than any individual loss. Sarah Martinez had entered the war as a skilled soldier doing her duty. She was leaving it as something more, a guardian of the peace and security that allowed people to build homes, raise families, and dream of quiet lives in beautiful places. The fire that took her cabin had forged something new in her, something that would serve her well in whatever battles lay ahead. 3 months later, Sarah returned to Montana. with enough money saved to begin rebuilding her grandfather's cabin. But she also returned with a new understanding of her calling as a soldier and as a protector of the things that made life worth living. The score had been settled, not just with Viper, but with the forces of chaos and destruction that threatened everything she held dear. The new cabin, when it was finished, would be built on the same stone foundation her grandfather had laid in 1952.
But it would also be built on something else, the knowledge that some things are worth fighting for, and that the skills she had learned in the mountains of Afghanistan would always be available to defend the peace and security of home. Standing on that foundation, looking out over Flathead Lake as her grandfather had done for so many years, Sarah Martinez knew that she had found her true calling.
She was a sniper, a guardian, and a keeper of the peace that allowed people to build lives worth protecting. The flames that had taken her first home had forged her into something stronger than she had ever imagined possible.
By dawn, a female sniper had indeed settled the score, not just with one terrorist leader, but with all the forces that threatened the simple dream of being able to build something good in the world and keep it safe.
Her shack went up in flames. By dawn, a female sniper had settled the score.